We are starting off 2025 strong as this week in gaming a lot has happened. From Black Myth Wukong's developers explaining why the game isn't out on Xbox, more Disney games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle potentially being on the way in the near future, Stardew Valley keeping a strong legacy with new information regarding game sale records, and more. So without further ado, let's talk about all of it on this week's episode of Twig. Now before we talk about Black Myth Wukong, did you know that the Xbox Series X/S does not support Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 7, however the base PlayStation 5 does support Wi-Fi 6, with the Pro PlayStation 5 supporting Wi-Fi 7. It's such a small issue at the end of the day that not too many people are ever really going to even notice, especially when a majority of the people are still on Wi-Fi 5. However, it is something that is wild to see how even as someone who tends to play on Xbox from time to time, I can still be disappointed by hearing that they just never decided to implement the support for updated Wi-Fi capabilities for some reason over to the Xboxes, meaning if you do have Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 7, you're not going to be able to get the full benefit out of it. Now, of course, that's not the only downside for Xbox, because Game Science, the developers behind Black Myth Wukong, have stated that the reason why the game has never released on Xbox isn't due to exclusivities or anything like that, but instead because of Microsoft's requirements to have a game on the Series X also release on the Series S as well, which due to the lower specs causes an issue for game developers struggling to keep a game's memory allocation under 10 gigabytes and struggling to convert what is powerful and possible on the Series X to something that is still somewhat possible and passable on the Series S as well. With only one game ever being exempt from the Series X/S parity rule being Baldur's Gate 3. And honestly, when you look at the games and stuff that go on with the Xbox, I just wish they would do something similar to the Nintendo 3DS when they ended up making the whole new 3DS model later down the line. This was something where when you go to the store page on the 3DS, there were some games that were too spec intensive that couldn't run on the older and less powerful 3DS, so they told you on that store, hey, you can't purchase this. This is a new 3DS only game. And I wish they would do something similar to that with Xbox by allowing console developers and stuff like that to go ahead and release their game on the Series X with a disclaimer on the Series S that it's not made for their version of the console. It could potentially raise the sales of a Series X while also allowing people to go ahead and know, hey, I'm getting the most bang out of my buck for this console that I can get, instead of having a situation where some games just don't release for a long time on the console due to them having an issue where they're trying to make it more compatible with that downgraded version of the Series X being the Series S. And one extra bit of information that is really funny to think about when you pay attention to what Game Science said is that Microsoft's official statement for why Black Myth Wukong wasn't on the Xbox is as follows: "We'd prefer not to comment on the deals made by our partners with other platform holders, but we can confirm that the delay is not due to Xbox platform limitations that have been raised to us." I think that's an interesting claim to make overall, because they're trying to say what was eventually said by Game Science isn't true. The whole entire fact that, oh yeah, the game hasn't released on here, not because it's not compatible with the Series S or anything, it's just because licensing limitations with other platforms, and come to find out that's not even true. It's the exact opposite of what Microsoft said that appears to actually be the true factor here. Now, there's also a developer who worked on a game before as a VFX artist who stated in a now deleted tweet a few years ago that there would be many developers who had actually been sitting in meetings for the past year trying desperately to get the Series S launch requirements dropped so that they could release a game on just the Series X and not be bottle capped by that Series S instead. But of course, all of these talks with the developers and Microsoft and everything else typically ends up failing, unless you're Baldur's Gate, I guess. But not all Microsoft news appears to be bad, because Indiana Jones and the Great Circle might have just sparked a slew of new Disney or Indiana Jones games in the near future with the same gameplay systems due to how successful the game was. This all started earlier last month when Lucasfilm Games Vice President and General Manager Douglas Riley stated that the team is always looking for great stories, and that the good news is there's a lot of space in between the films, especially Indiana Jones, where they could tell more and more stories that Douglas thinks would be super interesting to tell. Shortly after this, the Windows Central journalist Jez Corden mentioned that he heard apparently Disney picked up the phone and wants more Indiana Jones in the future, with the game having an estimated around 121,000 owners on Steam according to Steam Spy, which even if it is off by a couple thousand is a huge number due to the game also being on Game Pass and coming to PlayStation in the future. So hearing that we could get more Indiana Jones games in the future is super nice, especially when it feels like in the past, in the modern era at least, when we got about an Indiana Jones game, it was always locked behind being a LEGO experience, and this time around, it will be an actual fully fleshed out experience where you're not being LEGOified every corner you go in. Now, other than this, David Jaffe, the game designer and director behind games such as God of War, Twisted Metal, Mickey Mania, and more, states that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is his personal favorite game of 2024, with his only complaint being that it should have been around 20% shorter to actually complete, which is an interesting complaint to actually make overall, wanting your game to actually be shorter, but I can understand it if it feels like a game should be shorter in order to make it not feel drawn out to be a million years long just to get that extra few hours of playtime. But I'm gonna be honest, I feel like we popped that Xbox bubble, so let's hop on over to talk about PlayStation and Naughty Dog, as Naughty Dog's co-founder explains what drove the company to a Sony acquisition. Over on LinkedIn, Andy Gavin posted about Naughty Dog's finances over the years, talking about how early games they made back in the 1980s had a budget of under $50,000 each to make, with Rings of Power being made from 1988 to 1991 having a budget rise of around $100,000. Eventually, when they ended up making Crash Bandicoot from 1994 to 1996, costs then became insanely high, being $1.6 million to make, with games like Jak and Daxter skyrocketing that budget all the way up to $15 million. And by the time the game company entered the year 2004, they were spending $45 to $50 million to make a AAA game such as Jak 3, with the sentiment being that the budget has only continued to explode more and more into the sky with each year that passes. According to Gavin, the stress of financing these ballooning budgets independently was enormous enough that selling the company to Sony was the only logical choice in order to not only secure a financial future for Naughty Dog, but also to make sure that the studio had the resources it needed to keep making the best games they possibly could without being crushed by the weights of cost and other things, such as fearing that one slipped or failed project could ruin the entire company's ability to make new experiences. And honestly, it's really interesting to see an insight into AAA game development where not only do you have to worry about how good your project gets perceived by the public, but you also have to worry about companies restructuring or having layoffs, and what would happen if your company gets acquired by another company. It's also mind-boggling that I'm extra appreciative for the games we have now, even if I still don't agree with how some games launch and AAA games are actually being titled with a $70 price tag. And honestly, the last game I purchased that was a $70 price tag was Metaphor ReFantazio, which actually gets its own news topic today, as the director behind the game wants to turn it into Atlus's third RPG series after Shin Megami Tensei and Persona. I can't provide a one-to-one quote for the director as the interview was translated into English, but the general gist of it is that Katsura Hashino states sequels would actually be good, and the team that started development on Metaphor ReFantazio originally wanted to go into it with a plan of making it into Atlus's third RPG series anyways, wanting to develop the game franchise into that signature IP that not only represents the company more and more, but shows them what they're able to do. And honestly, I'm completely down with that because Atlus is one of the few companies that I am in awe with every time I play the games they make, due to not only just how much effort and creativity can be seen in the game alone, but also the menus. It's something that I don't get shocked by too often due to a menu usually just being that boring place you click settings in. They managed to make the menus tell its own story, filling in world with what you play, having unique designs and panels for everything you go into, and honestly, I don't mind being called an Atlus simp. I'll gladly simp for this company if they want to keep treating us to some beautiful games with amazing details, not only in the gameplay itself, but also in the menus you click through. Speaking of companies I suck up for, however, let's talk about RGG Games, the studio behind Yakuza Like a Dragon and Judgment. Back at the Game Awards, they announced a new game called Project Century, and since then, not much was revealed other than Snoop Dogg apparently being involved with the game's development somehow. But I feel speculating over what this game will be is the incorrect way to go about it, as during a broadcast on December 26th, Yokoyama claimed that every single fan theory and speculative piece online that he has seen regarding Project Century is flat out wrong, with them intentionally not including any information that would enable people to guess what the game is going to actually be and what is actually going on in this game to begin with. The only truly confirmed details is that it's an action-adventure game like previous RGG games that have been made before, such is Yakuza, and it takes place in 1915. Other than this, a trademark was filed relating to the game previously, with the company inside of the game world being translated to roughly Japan Trade Company, and clothing having text that reads out, "No matter how far, we have no limits, we are as fast as lightning." And while none of this really means much as of right now, I will eat up every single grain of RGG game information that I can find as I continue to play through all the other Yakuza games that already exist. I mean, they give you like 50 hours of playtime just to beat the main game for like the newer Like a Dragon games anyways, but you know what? It's a good time to be had, so I ain't complaining. If you need a new game to play, however, this is an older game, but it's a guilty pleasure of mine, and it's Risk of Rain 2. You may have noticed me using it as background footage for today's video in some sections here and there, but this is an action roguelike adventure where you work solo or with your friends to escape a chaotic alien planet by fighting through hordes of monsters. The longer it takes you to complete a play session, the harder the enemies will get, adding an almost natural speedrun feeling into the game's mechanics, making you want to go fast in order to get to the end, and also wanting you to also min-max your run so you can get as powerful as possible. It's a little bit of a power balance between, do I want to go fast or do I want to be powerful, but at the same time you got to keep in mind the slower you go, the more powerful everything else around you also gets. Now, I haven't purchased the Seekers of the Storm DLC yet due to it having a pretty rough launch, but I have heard it's improved. Even without buying the DLC though, this game can be fun on its own just by having the base game, so definitely check it out if you're into the roguelike genre or you just want something new to pick up and try. Switching over to talk about money and successful games, we have to talk about IDG Consulting and the DFC, who are industry research firms that predict that Grand Theft Auto 6 will not only be one of the biggest launches in gaming history, but will also be one of the biggest launches in all of media and entertainment history, potentially generating over $1 billion in revenue due to how high the demand and how anticipated GTA 6 is after over a decade of GTA 5 being the newest game that we're able to play. I mean, in 2 days alone, the Grand Theft Auto 6 trailer got over 100 million views, with it now having around 231 million views a whole entire year later, which is honestly wild to think about that it's already been over a year since they announced the trailer for Grand Theft Auto 6. Speaking of money and success, however, Stardew Valley has officially reached over 41 million lifetime sales across all platforms as of December 2024, with Concerned Ape explaining that 26 million copies have been sold on PC, 7.9 million copies were sold on the Switch, with no information provided regarding consoles and phones. But man, having a game that released in 2016, which is 9 years ago, now continuing to thrive and grow more and more as time goes on, is a super insane thing to think about, but also an exciting thing to hear because it means the demand is there for this game's genre, and if you do it well enough, the players will come. Now for our final topic of the week, let's talk about Nintendo's Punch-Out series. The last official entry in the Punch-Out series was released on the Wii in 2009, and was the first entry to the series in over 15 years, which ironically enough might also be the last entry in the series ever. According to Imran Khan on Reset Era, they spoke to someone from a studio close to the Punch-Out series who was drunk at a bar once, and they asked specifically about a new Punch-Out game potentially happening in the future, to which the drunk person mentioned that there was significantly more backlash against the characters in the Wii version of the game than they had originally expected, with the team spending a lot of time assuring Nintendo that they weren't leaning into bad stereotypes that would get called out this time. So due to the game's backlash, everyone kind of just furrowed their brow and called the game series done, especially since other games from the same team had much higher sales potential compared to Punch-Out's potential sell highs. While this could explain away any chance for a new Punch-Out game in the future, we have to keep in mind that the person explaining this wasn't in the studio that made Punch-Out, but instead a studio close to this studio. So there is some vague clouds up in the air that hold out hope for a sequel, but don't get your hopes up too high, as I personally still believe what was said there is true, and we won't be seeing a new Punch-Out game anytime soon, especially when the studio can work on stuff such as Luigi's Mansion instead. Until next week, however, go enjoy some older games and bundle up with some blankets if you're in a location that is getting colder and colder this January. And until next week, I'll see you guys a little bit later for another episode of Twig.